The Charles River Museum's Mill Talk series is made possible by a grant from the Lowell Institute and by the support of our museum members. To become a member, visit charlesrivermuseum.org/join. To follow us here on YouTube, click subscribe and hit like if you enjoyed this video.
Good evening. Polly Darnell is a former archivist and librarian who spent 20 years running the research center at the Sheldon Museum in Vermont, just up the road from Middlebury. The Sheldon Museum did and still holds such a very rich collection of historical records, both print, manuscript, and graphics, that you might say that Middlebury, Vermont is the best documented town in New England. When Mrs. Darnell retired, she liked to say that the favorite part of the job working in the research center was being able to connect researchers with sources that helped them tell new stories about the past. The story that she's going to tell us tonight, as I understand it, is how she connected with the founder of this museum with regard to the discovery of the Markham drawings.
Thank you, Dan. I'm very excited to be here. Partly, I was here back in 1981, before this museum was open, talking with Mike Folsom, the founder, about the great find. And now I see so much has happened here. It's wonderful. But back in 1981, while I was working at the Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, I took a summer course in industrial archaeology up at UVM. As we went around the room the first day introducing ourselves, I must have said that I was from the Sheldon Museum and I was taking the class because we'd found some interesting drawings. I wanted to understand them better. And one of the teachers, the Smithsonian's curator of mechanical and civil engineering, burst out, "You, the find of the century." Word had spread through the Society of Industrial Archaeology, grapevine, that early 19th century drawings of textile machinery had been found. Drawings by a previously unknown mechanic, Isaac Markham, that were decades earlier than the earliest known drawings of US machines. This was heady stuff for a young archivist. But of course, it wasn't me. It was a whole series of people who had a part in the find, including a crucial role played by Mike Folsom, the founder of this museum. I'm going to tell the story of Isaac Markham and his remarkable drawings, some of them made here in the legendary workshop of Paul Moody at the Boston Manufacturing Company, and how they came to light more than 150 years later and were eventually published, recognizing that it is never just one person's story. Each story is shaped by the web of personal connections across different people, places, Middlebury, Vermont, New Hampshire, Waltham, Massachusetts, and institutions, including the Sheldon Museum, where I once worked, and the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. Both stories are about how knowledge spreads, whether knowledge of innovations or of the past. Excuse me a moment. Isaac Markham grew up in Middlebury, Vermont, midway up the western side of the state, in a town that had recently been settled by European Americans from southern New England. In 1796, the year after Isaac was born, the village area, centered on the falls of Otter Creek, was still covered with forest, with small individual clearings near the falls for about 40 small houses, 2 grist mills, 2 sawmills, a forge and gun factory, 2 taverns, and a fuller. Every year, new businesses joined them. A potashery, blacksmiths, a cabinet maker, a marble quarry and mill, another forge and furnace, a clothier, a distillery, merchants, carriage maker, carpenters, more taverns. Isaac grew up right in the middle of all this activity. His earliest years spent living in one of the sawmills. His father had set up a nail factory in one room of the sawmill and moved the family in there when he fell on hard financial times. Eventually, they were able to build and move into a house nearby that was eventually enlarged to a public house that drew a wide range of people. The building also served as an early meeting place for the Episcopal Church Society and for the local chapter of the Freemasons, a group that figured in Isaac's later life. As his brother later described in an affidavit for a lawsuit between the owners of a woolen mill and a marble quarry, their walk to school took them right by the falls and the many mills, all of which seems to have intrigued Isaac. His father, Captain Ebenezer Markham, the son of a Connecticut minister, was a former sea captain, and their mother, Sarah Kellogg Markham, although deprived of much of an education when her family lost their home during the American Revolution, was said by a U.S. senator to have written the best letters of any of his constituents. They knew the value of education and saw to it that Isaac, his brother, and sister were educated beyond the usual common school. Besides horsemanship, dancing, and everything but music, Isaac studied mathematics with a graduate of the University of Cambridge, while his brother went on to the local grammar school to study Latin, prior to studying law with a prominent local lawyer who was a Freemason, like their father, who died in 1813. What interested Isaac, however, was the machinery in the mills. Family lore claimed that as a child, after building models of them, he had suggested improvements to both the ganged saws in the marble mill and to a picking machine that a couple of men were developing. Both improvements were said to have been adopted. Exploring in the mills and experimenting via models would have been not only his introduction to the world of machines, but also laid the ground for developing tacit knowledge of machinery, how it worked, looked, sounded, and felt when it was running well or not. This kind of knowledge is critical for developing good judgment that he used later. But imagine how exciting it was. This was the infancy of the Industrial Revolution that transformed the production of goods from handmade to factory-made. The Industrial Revolution arrived in Middlebury in 1801 when the first carding mill in the county was brought to the area around the falls, his neighborhood. 6-year-old Isaac was probably right there studying it along with the people who came from miles around. You can see some of the mills and the neighborhood here in a drawing that was done in the late 19th century, and Ebenezer Markham's Tavern in the lower center right along Main Street. In this ferment, immigrants brought new ideas and techniques from Britain, teaching them to Americans who spread them further, as American merchants, cut off from European markets by the Napoleonic Wars, invested in factories where the new techniques were tried out. Such was the case in Middlebury, where a merchant, David Page, who had earlier come from Jaffrey, New Hampshire, built a cotton mill next to the grist mill he'd already invested in. Mill machinery at this time was all built on site by master builders who had learned the new technology either from immigrants who had brought knowledge of it with them from Britain or from others taught by them. Instead of schools, there were machine shops of the bigger and more advanced mills where young men worked and learned before heading off to spread the machinery to new factories. In 1812, David Page hired Isaac Markham, who was then 17 years old, to assist his machine builders. There he made his first connections to the network of machinists vital to the spread of technology. In this painting, the cotton mill is the building on the far left next to the falls. There's just a corner of it showing there. Keep that in mind. You'll see a better picture later. The importance of personal connections between people and places show up in the chain that connected the mechanics and the mill owners. The builder of the cotton factory in Middlebury was David Page, who had come from Jaffrey, New Hampshire. He was also a merchant who probably regularly traveled to the Boston area or nearby for goods, and would probably have stayed in touch with people in his hometown, possibly family, or with people nearby, and would certainly have known either personally or by reputation Samuel Batchelder, who was also from Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and who became a cotton manufacturer in New Ipswich, which was just 10 miles away. David Page hired Charles Robbins, Samuel Batchelder had working for him Charles Robbins in the New Ipswich mill. Robbins had learned at the Slater Mill in Rhode Island, the first to bring some early cotton technology from England to this country, and a major hub of machine learning. John Houghton was said to be from New Ipswich, New Hampshire, and as was Jesse Holton, who had definitely worked for the Batchelder's cotton factory. So they were bringing basically another generation of Slater Mill technology to Middlebury, the far western edge of northern New England. David Meyer, in his 2006 book, Networked Machinists, High Technology Industries in Antebellum America, has plotted so-called nests, where industrial immigrants bringing technical knowledge attracted artisans who worked and were trained by them, then disseminated their knowledge across the region as they trained and interacted with others. One of the first nests was created by Samuel Slater, whose arrival from England, where he had managed an Arkwright mill, signaled the beginning of the American cotton industry. The network that spread from him extended all the way to Middlebury, where Isaac tapped into it. In addition to the knowledge that these men brought, Markham also had access to the single most important source of visual information on Britain's manufacturing. Rees's Cyclopedia, published between 1802 and 1820, included articles and illustrations about the textile industry, among many other topics. Access to it was limited. There was an American edition, but it was expensive. There were 6 subscribers in the whole state of Vermont, and 2 of them were in Middlebury. One was the president of Middlebury College, who Markham may have known, and the other was Daniel Chipman, the Freemason and lawyer who was teaching Isaac's brother the law. Having taken an interest in the boys after their father's death, as a Freemason would for a brother, he would certainly have made Rees available to Isaac. In 1814, Isaac started this portfolio of drawings. He dated the cover, November 8, 1814, wrote his name on it, and that's one of the few times that he did actually put the date and place on anything related to his drawings. As he was working and learning then, he was complementing the tacit knowledge that he had gained as a child and applying it to in a new type of mill. Not only was the new technology developing and being shared, but a new way of representing it in drawings was coming into use that required a new way of seeing. This drawing of a power loom is conventional, using perspective. But perspective, which dates back to the Renaissance and is how we've almost all learned, at least in the European tradition, to understand depth when it's represented on a two-dimensional surface, has a problem for machine builders in that it foreshortens. It uses foreshortening, which hides surfaces and dimensions, which are what the builder needs. Machine builders then turned to the convention that was used by architects and some builders of using elevations and plans. You can see here, the top view is looking down from above, and the bottom one is a side view, looking at it straight on. These have their problems as well, but they did show something that could be used by mechanics. There was another way of doing it that had been pioneered in Europe and it was being adopted in some areas, most notably at West Point around 1817 or 18. But it hadn't really made it into the mechanics networks yet. This was orthogonal projection, in which all the parts are shown in scale at their actual size, not foreshortened. Markham was using scale in his drawings, as you can see along the bottom, those lines. In this elevation, he has added color, presumably to identify parts made of a different material. The drawings, whether they were published or Markham's own, didn't convey enough information to actually build machines, though this artifact right here suggests differently. The drawings lacked such data as dimensions, angles, tolerances, numbers of gear teeth. Construction materials were not usually specified, nor did they include the essential operating instructions. Besides the drawings, Markham would have to make lists of the components needed, which included both wooden parts and metal work, requiring a variety of skills. These wouldn't be made by just one person. A valuable addition to the network arrived in 1817. Joseph Corden arrived in Middlebury from Scotland with drawings of power looms. At least that's the story in the local history and the information that was provided by him to the local historian. David Jeremy, the lead author of our book about Markham, found no record of Gordon in his research on textile machine builders who had emagrated to the US. And there's the question, even bigger in my mind, of what network connected him to Middlebury. How did he even know of it? I mean, you get off the boat in Boston and you're in a new country. What tells you to go to the far reaches of the northern part of the region? It just seems so unlikely. There must have been some sort of personal connection, but we have found no record of what it was. We've learned where he went afterwards, several other things, know something of his children, but what brought him to Middlebury is unknown. It was a stroke of luck for Markham, though. As we wait for the planes to go over. There are only a couple of other sites in the US with power looms. Here at the Boston Manufacturing Company in Waltham and William Gilmore's in Rhode Island, built by another immigrant. That would make Middlebury the third place in New England to have power looms. Markham worked with Gordon to build the new machines. By 1819, he had learned all he could from his available sources, the more knowledgeable and experienced machine builders who had come to town, and from publications. He would have seen all the articles on cotton manufacturing in Rees's Cyclopedia. Ownership of the cotton factory was changing, and the former master builder, Jesse Holton, was taking charge. That may have seemed like a good time to make a change and set out on the road to see what he could learn. In 1819, David Page wrote him a letter of recommendation, which was saved with his drawings. This may certify that Isaac E. Markham has worked for me a considerable part of his time, building cotton and woolen machinery since 1812, and the last year and a half, particularly making power looms, with all its accompanying parts, which I have had in operation more than 12 months. My looms I would not exchange for any other made on any other plan which has come to my knowledge. Mr. Markham has been the superintendent and draftsman of them. I consider him perfectly capable of doing every part of the iron and brass work after forged, and that he is honest and entitled to the confidence of the public. The drawings he has is his of his own execution. They speak for themselves. Not a bad recommendation, and it says that he was the one who was superintending the building of the looms. Another curious aspect of the Gordon story. But it says that he's a draftsman, can supervise building, can do the iron and brass work, and is entitled to every confidence. Markham headed first down to Dover, New Hampshire, to cotton mills there. He worked there for perhaps a year, we don't know for certain. Their 1820 inventory, however, included 2 warping machines with stop motions with 2 dressing of Adams and Markham's plan, confirming that he was making innovations. He wasn't just building what he was seeing other people do. He was improving on it. Then he came to Waltham. It was the Boston Manufacturing Company was the leading cotton manufacturer at the time, and Paul Moody's machine shop was the leading machine shop in New England now, and the hub of a whole community of textile machine builders and related shops like the iron foundries. These people all communicated with each other and shared their knowledge and connections that spread across New England as people came and worked here, learned, went on, and stayed in touch. It seems to have been a fairly tight community. It was a small group. They were doing something innovative, and they were the only people doing it. It was not a large crowd. I think of how it must have been somewhat like the very early days of home computing, when people were learning to code, and how exciting it would be to talk to other people who were doing it, and how they were learning to, in a way, speak in a new language as they talked about binary and ways of putting things together. This sketch is of the Boston Manufacturing Company. The red building on the left is the second mill that was built here. And the little projecting parts of it are the picker houses where cotton was processed. The wooden, the penciled in drawings are company housing. It's kind of interesting to see they alternate 2-story and 1-story. This drawing figures in the story of how we connected Middlebury and Waltham. From Waltham, however, Markham wrote a stinging account of management's treatment of the workforce in a letter to his brother. I think it shows up partly the values that he had been taught by his father and absorbed in the community, and that he had his own ideas about how things should be and what relations between people should be like. In May 30th of 1821, he wrote to his brother, "They are anxious that I should return to Dover and say they will employ me for 5 years if I choose. Advise me what is best to do. If I can get employed for the same wages that I used to have, had I better not accept? That company is rather unfair in some treatment towards hands. In this company are perfectly upright in their money dealings with the workmen, though they have all the lordly and tyrannical feelings that were ever felt by the greatest despots in the world. Though they have ever treated me well, but still they are determined their word shall be law and shall be obeyed. A few weeks since, they cut down every unmarried man's wages, except mine, that they employ, and without giving them the least notice until the day came for payment. The same trick was played off on the girls, but they, as one, revolted, and the work stopped 2 days in consequence. I have been busy for some considerable time making some mechanical calculations, therefore cannot bring my mind to writing. Excuse my scrawling. Affectionately yours, I.E. Markham." This would be the first industrial strike in the U.S. Unfortunately, there hasn't been solid corroboration of it, though I was told that there was a substantial and consistent pay cut from February to September of 1821. I understand that Lois Gonzalez may have written about it in her dissertation, Female Mill Workers and the Mechanization of Textile Production, but I haven't learned what the results are, if anything more solid has been shown to prove that the girls shut down the works. Whoops, that's the letter. And this is a page from a small but careful notebook of drawings. It includes machine components and mechanisms for a factory power system, including a governor, the device at the top, and stands for rollers in the middle. It's impossible to know for certain which drawings he was working on here or elsewhere, since he rarely noted the dates or places. The drawings were a way to test out ideas, to see what might work without building models or full-scale machines, as some people had to do to figure out whether something would work. This is a dresser, one of the machines that Markham worked on improving, probably because it was such an unpleasant job for operatives, who got higher pay than most positions, but who had to work in a hot and humid room, leading to high turnover among them. He was on the payroll of the Boston Manufacturing Company from September 2nd, 1820 through December 1st, 1821. We don't know for sure where he was after that. He may have traveled, as we had a fragment of paper that he had cut out to use for a pattern, but it had Exeter, New Hampshire on it. And there was a sketch of Passaic Falls in New Jersey found in his papers. but there's nothing else to tell us. His papers, there are the occasional, those 2 letters, the drawings, the notebooks of drawings, and that's about it. At some point in the early 20s, he returned to his hometown of Middlebury and the cotton mill where he'd started, the big building shown here on the left. He became the superintendent and agent of the factory, a job that required not only mechanical skills, but also leadership and skills in managing the workforce, as well as the supply of materials. The factory was in the midst of an expansion in 1825, increasing the number of looms to 80 and building a gas plant to light the factory. The Middlebury newspaper claimed when it was finally completed in 1827 that it was the first factory in the US lit by gas. But suddenly in September, Markham died of typhus. His death was a loss not only to the factory but to the community. His funeral was attended by everyone employed in the cotton factory, several lodges of Freemasons, the members of a Middlebury College Literary and Debating Society, though he hadn't attended the college. The unusually long obituary in the newspaper suggests the high esteem the townspeople held him in. It said, "We have never witnessed a larger or more respectable assemblage of people upon any similar occasion. It was, however, but a just tribute of respect to the deceased, who, without the advantages of birth or fortune, by the force of talents and virtue alone, had succeeded in the esteem and affections of his fellow citizens. Distinguished as he was for noble and generous feelings, for independent and manly sentiments, warm and unwavering friendship, undeviating and exact rectitude, he was still more distinguished by a mind of singular felicity of invention, originality, and strength of conception, and of rich and abundant resource. Relying upon his own exertions with untiring assiduity, he had carefully cultivated his uncommon powers until he had become one of the first mechanicians in this section of our country. While his personal friends weep over his untimely death, the public will deplore his loss as a serious misfortune to the community." He was 30 years old. So what had he accomplished in his life? Aside from developing a character that was widely admired and valued among the people that he, in his many different networks, personal, cultural, social, professional. Aside from that reputation, he was probably responsible for 3 or possibly 4 elements in textile machines modified in New England to meet local social and economic needs. When machines came from England, they were being used in conditions that were not exactly the same as what was there. They had to be adapted to conditions here, and he helped do that. He helped to modify and spread the Waltham system of labor-saving technology through northern New England. He would have been training other machine builders in the mill when they were doing that major expansion. He wasn't doing all that himself alone, especially while superintending the mill. He was probably a catalyst for the introduction of power looms to northern New England. He was a proponent of projective drawing of machines, the technique being adopted slowly by machine builders. The factory survived It was a rough time, but it was eventually stabilized and continued until at least 1858. How long its prosperity continued after that is unknown. In 1882, the factory closed for good and its machinery was sold to parties in Alabama. A few years later, the factory burned along with much of downtown, and the stones were used in new buildings, except for a small portion that was rebuilt and used as a powerhouse, first for a marble mill across the creek, running power by means of ropes and pulleys, then for hydroelectric generation. You see the remains of it there, with trees growing up through it. Markham's reputation suffered similarly as the people who knew him died or moved on. In the late 19th century, his family, by then consisting of 2 nephews, tried to get the local historical society to commemorate his inventiveness. The society, made up of a select group of men, most of whom were associated with Middlebury College, devoted their efforts to disproving the family's, by then, exaggerated claims. Markham had probably made some improvement to the raising and lowering of the gangs of saws in the marble mill. That was something that the owner, Eben Judd, patented in the early 20s, when Isaac was in town and would have known what was going on. Isaac never patented any of his improvements to machines. As one of his nephews said, he thought everybody was his friend. No one would take advantage of him, and he didn't care about personal credit for that. The nephews, however, said that Isaac had invented the method of sawing marble that was used in the mill, using sand and water and iron saws. The society did research and found that no, that was invented in Ireland 4,000 years ago. Therefore, he couldn't have come up with that. Well, it's unlikely that he even conceived of that, and that was what the mill owner put into operation, because the mill owner was in financial difficulties when he started quarrying the bed of the creek, and he would not have built a mill on the say-so of a child who had figured out some new technique. So it languished. His reputation did. But his legacy was rescued by a friend of one of the nephews. Henry Sheldon, shown here standing on the porch of his museum, was a Middlebury businessman and musician, and he had founded a museum to collect records and artifacts commemorating the early settlers of Middlebury and surrounding towns. Increasing deafness forced him to give up music, at which point his collecting intensified, leading to a wealth of documentation still being mined by historians and others in various fields. It's not surprising then that Thomas Henry MacLeod gave the precious relics of his uncle, his drawings and papers and a portrait, to the museum, pictured here. Henry Sheldon was collecting a lot of different material. He tried to collect everything printed in Middlebury since 1801, when printing started there, including all the newspapers, all the books, all the pamphlets, ephemera, as well as collecting the papers of past residents, often from people's attics. In the 1890s, 10 years after incorporating the museum, Sheldon wrote that he couldn't keep up. He collected others would have to catalog. Cataloging of the collection began with a WPA project in the 1930s, including all that printed material and 30,000 handwritten letters individually cataloged. It's some process, probably because they didn't fit into any category being used to sort the manuscript material. Markham's drawings were cataloged with the books. If you look closely at this in the upper left corner, you can see the Dewey Decimal Classification number for engineering. And here's the lone catalog card. It was not something that was likely to be found by anyone who would be interested. When I happened upon this portfolio in the book stacks, it was clear that it belonged instead with the manuscripts, but that we needed to know more about the drawings and the author in order to make them accessible to researchers. That's when networks kicked in again. I showed this drawing that was with the others to a former museum colleague who happened to have recently seen a catalog from Skinner, the auction house, and had particularly noticed a painting of the Boston Manufacturing Company, but from a different angle. So he said, "This is Waltham." And we knew that these were drawings of machines. My father was active in the Southern New England chapter of the Society for Industrial Archaeology. So I asked him who would or should know about them. Soon after, I got this letter from Mike Folsom, then in the process of establishing the Charles River Museum, just saying that Vic had told him that I had some information about a Middlebury millwright who moved down to Waltham, and that they were just now doing research on the skilled workers who came here. So he would appreciate hearing about it. He also wanted to know more about the mill because of his interest in industrial archaeology. It's kind of funny that he addressed it to me at the Shelburne Museum. That's why the Sheldon Museum changed its name to the Henry Sheldon Museum, to try to keep it straight, though I did end up working at the Shelburne Museum years later. Our correspondence flew back and forth during the summer and fall of 1981, and Mike and his wife Marcia, now the president of this museum, visited at the end of July. We made a full set of photocopies of the drawings for Mike to study and to share with others. Looking back through the files of the Sheldon Museum about looking at this correspondence, I came across this photo of Mike from a newsletter. He's shown here with a delegation from the People's Republic of China that were here to visit the Standard Thompson Company, but came over to see a bit of history at the museum. My father had put me in touch with just the right person, in part because of Mike's extensive network of connections with textile historians. It would have been through this network that the Smithsonian curator mentioned at the beginning of the talk heard of the find. Before founding this museum in 1980, Mike had taught at MIT in the Humanities Department and in the program in Science, Technology, and Society. He'd had an NEH grant to develop methods for teaching the history of industry. His interests in the subject weren't confined to academia. He'd been the president of the Southern New England Society of Industrial Archaeology and served as secretary of the National SIA Board. He was very well connected. He recruited Larry Gross, then the curator of the Merrimack Valley Textile Museum, Pat Malone, then director of the Slater Mill Historic Site, and Theodore Penn, then a researcher in the history of technology at Old Sturbridge Village, to identify the drawings. They met to review the set of photocopies they'd been given and identified what they could, shared the news, and applied for grants to fund an analysis and publication of them while getting this museum up and running. Unfortunately, the funding didn't come through, and Mike's untimely death in 1990 put an end to any further efforts. One person was missing from the list of people that Mike had recruited. That was David Jeremy, though Mike corresponded with him about the drawings. David had been a research associate at the Smithsonian's Museum of History and Technology and curator at the Merrimack Valley Textile Museum before Larry, but had returned to England, where he was then a research fellow at the Business History Unit at the London School of Economics. His dissertation on the transfer of textile to technology between Britain and America had just been published that year, just a little too soon. It was tantalizing having the drawings turn up right afterwards. The drawings stuck in David's mind. When he retired from teaching business history at Manchester Metropolitan University Business School, he decided it was time to turn his attention to the unfinished project of Isaac Markham's drawings, placing them in historical context. He still had my name and contacted the Sheldon Museum. I'd left 10 years earlier, but because he had my name, they sent on his message. The upshot was that this book was published by the American Philosophical Society in 2010 with an in-depth analysis of all of the drawings, as well as an essay placing Isaac Markham within the context of the infant cotton manufacturing industry. In addition, David was persuaded to consider the drawings in terms of visual knowledge and how representation of machines for purposes of reproducing them required a different way of representing them on paper. The acknowledgments in bibliography make it clear that even though only one of the people on Mike's team is listed, it took a network of scholars to analyze the drawings and contribute to the story. I'll add that I was not one of that network of scholars analyzing the drawings, which to me are still rather mysterious. Anything I know about them, I know from David's writing. My part was researching Isaac Markham and getting the most detail from the drawings available to him. So the networks are what kicked in when Isaac was learning to build machines, when we were trying to identify what these drawings were and what their significance was, when a detailed analysis of them was being done. Whether this was the find of the century depends on your perspective. For people who were interested in how the textile industry and other industries were built in this country, this is part of the foundation that has been rather lacking. Imagine having a revolution going on and you have no access to afterwards to what was actually happening in that era. Because machine drawings simply don't survive, there's whole huge gaps in the knowledge of how they came to be. It's not just how you build them, it's how you run them. I don't know if you can see this wonderful machine here. The power loom that was built here by about 15 years ago by people using Isaac Markham's drawings because that's what there was. But those drawings didn't give the angles, the details, the teeth, and what the tolerances are for them, how you can make it run. It is so exciting to see this. It's an astonishing piece of work. It was amazing when Isaac Markham was doing it back in the early 19th century, along with that whole web of other machine builders. And it's still amazing to me now that people can come together in these networks and try to recreate that using so few sources. For me, it was simply a great satisfaction to rescue these documents and give them a new life. If you visit Middlebury today, you can walk down Main Street and see the little bit that's left of the cotton mill still standing, though probably not for long. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, Polly. You've added a wonderful perspective to, I've read the book and read their correspondence with Mike from the 80s, but hearing the story from you really brings it to life. The big mystery, which it's unfair of me to put it forward because it remains a mystery perhaps, but at the time when Mike looked at the drawings, it said that he identified them as probable textile manufacturing equipment from the early BMC. So the question I would love to have an answer to is, well, did he give any indication of his rationale that led him to make the connection between what he saw in the drawings and what other information he had that led him to believe that that Markham was drawing things that he saw here at the BMC?
And that, I'm afraid I can't answer, Dan. I can speculate, but I don't know. I think that so little was known at that time. People were just starting to learn about how this technology spread. I think that the Myers book about the networked people, I think, if I remember correctly, that came out around 2005. That would have been pretty exciting research to have figured that all out. I think that in 1980, the state of research and understanding of that era was so limited that it would be reasonable to assume that anything good that turned up was from one of these hubs, like here or Slater, and they could tell some of it wasn't Slater, it was a different technology. So it would be a reasonable assumption that it was here. But that was before people knew that, gee, technology was brought from Scotland to Middlebury. And there are still, as I said, there are still gaps in what we know about that. Other than that, that would be my speculation, is that it might have been an assumption based on the limited knowledge available at the time, which is still pretty limited in many ways.
Okay. That's very helpful. Just jumping around a little bit, you spoke about Markham's, I could say, disdain for the management practices of the BMC here. I don't know what type of management was in place in the Middlebury mills or the Dover mills or the mills at Ipswich. since I work here, I know all about the BMC as putting forth the management structure which gave birth to the modern corporation, where the guys that handle the money and go think about marketing and long-term planning, they're over here. And over here are the people who deal day to day with the workers and the labor. And do you think that was that significantly different than how management dealt with labor at such a remove than perhaps other places that Markham was employed? And you could say it was a harsher, less humane kind of an interaction than he was used to.
I think that's entirely possible. The Middlebury mill, though there was a Middlebury manufacturing company incorporated, it's really unclear from the few records we have what role, if any, that played in the cotton factory. It was small enough that I think it would have been one person in charge of it. And that person, presumably David Page, would have been interacting directly with the people who worked there. Yeah. And because it was a small community, they would be seeing each other outside of the factory. And he would not have been able to walk home without passing by the boarding house where the young women who worked there were staying.
Whereas here, the people in charge, you had to get on a horse and go all the way to Boston. So.
Yes. So I think it would have been the relationship between the owners and employees would have been very different.
The final thing of many that strikes me is I know a good bit about Paul Moody and what sort of skill set he had. I don't know much about him from the standpoint of being a draftsman. He was very visual. He could look at something and apparently build it from the images that he had in his
Wow.
head. I don't even know whether he read drawings or not, but from the standpoint of looking at something and figuring out a way to improve on it, make it better, seemed to be where his strength lay. And I get the impression, which you might comment on, that Markham was much the same, although he had, a great skill for documenting and for putting down on paper what he was working on.
Yes, I imagine that if someone is has spent much of their life learning to think in terms of the machines, and it has experience being around them, as Markham did from simply playing around machinery as a kid in the Falls, that you develop a sense of what must be required to actually build one of them.
Yeah, the story is that's kind of how Moody grew up as well.
They were remarkable men. I think it's just amazing what they did manage to achieve.
So both Moody and Markham were familiar with what was in England and what was, to use the word, diffusing into this country, and familiar with existing designs and so forth. What is your take on Markham as an inventor himself? The dresser sounds to me like something that might have been purely his imagination, his concept.
I can't really speak to his specific machines because I don't understand them that well. I do think David Jeremy had pointed out, it was one that he seems to have done a lot of work on and returned to several times, trying to work out problems that would make the process of adding size to the warp threads less unpleasant and more efficient, so that less time would have to be spent on it, which seems to me a very worthwhile thing to be taking into consideration. It is a matter that's of economy for the mill, but also more humane for the operatives. And I think just the way he spoke of the Boston Manufacturing Company's attitude, that concern for the people was important. I think that's something that he probably got from his parents, who had their backgrounds had exposed them to great harm during the American Revolution. They both, when she was a child, Sally's family lost everything. They lost their property, they were forced from their property. Her father and brother were captured and transported to Montreal, where her father died. Her brother was imprisoned, and that left Sally, her sisters, and her mother to make their own way with no help. And as she said she actually did an oral history in the 1840s. And as she said, in that, we only sometimes fell into humane hands after that. She ended, actually, she then had that turned into an application for a pension, and ended it saying, "My whole life has been a political warfare." I suspect it's some of her attitude that Isaac absorbed and carried on.
That makes sense.
Showing in that letter. Well, thank you so much for having invited me down here to give this talk and see the great loom. It's been very exciting. It's been fun to revisit one of my favorite historical people in Middlebury and this whole topic, and to see the physical embodiment of these drawings. Thank you.